When the first season of The Last of Us came out, I was in what many professional YouTubers would call a good position for the algorithm. There was this popular show receiving a ton of praise from both the critical world and the world of everyday viewers that I was basically not a fan of at all. You could even say that I hated it, and I was ready to drop this nuclear take on my unsuspecting viewers. Oh, how the contrarianism would prove irresistible, and views would start flooding in left and right. But this was also unrelated. A pretty bad period in my life, and I started to worry that I was maybe bringing my own personal baggage into my critical assessment of the show. That in fact, everyone else's enjoyment of it stoked a spiteful fire within me that I was a mere 15 minutes of babbling into this here Rode condenser mic away from unleashing into the world. So I bit my tongue, and I didn't make the video. Well, Season 2 just came out. My life is certainly better now, and guess what? The show still sucks. It wasn't me. Before I really get into this, I want to issue a disclaimer I wouldn't normally think to add, but The Last of Us is one of those discursively radioactive properties that people get way too nasty about until it becomes a serious, real-world problem. So I just want to say at the start here that I attribute none of the show's failure to Bella Ramsey, and I don't condone any of the harassment they've received from fans of the games. I don't say this to virtue signal or establish myself as holier than thou, but rather to indicate that, even though I'm about to say a lot of unfavorable things about the show, the last thing I want is for this video to become ammunition in what I see as an unconscionable hate campaign. That out of the way, you might be wondering why I had such a vitriolic reaction to the first season, but the weird thing about it was that it really snuck up on me. I was a big fan of the show Chernobyl, so I was happy to see where creator and showrunner Craig Mazin went from there, having sort of re-established himself in Hollywood as a serious writer. But the season overall just really didn't do much for me. It felt like a series of empty obstacles and shallow characters marching through arbitrary detours to an abrupt ending. My biggest takeaway by the end of the season was that this show is basically nothing. There's nothing here. Nothing offensively terrible. Nothing particularly great. Perfectly balanced pH levels. This show, in my view, was the sensory equivalent of drinking a glass of water. But the more I sat on the show, and the more I thought about it within and without the context of a potential YouTube video, the more I began to see it as a show whose every element is working against its own dramatic best interests. A show torn between the dueling aspirations of being as direct a translation of the games as possible, and being the next Game of Thrones. Both of these goals have proven to be futile, and in this pursuit, the show has totally imploded. I think people are starting to share this sentiment a little more with the latest season, but my issues with the show go all the way back to the start. Let's look at the first of these ill-conceived aspirations. In addition to the Craig Mazin meta-narrative, I was looking forward to watching this show because I hadn't played the games. All I knew, at least about the first game, was that this guy Joel had to escort this girl Ellie somewhere during a zombie apocalypse, and that was about it. I knew a little more about the second game, but somehow I escaped the first game's ubiquity, and I felt like I was in the unique position of having a totally untainted experience, engaging with the narrative on its own merit. This proved to be a fatal mistake. Mazin has been outspoken about taking a fan-first approach to the show, basing his storytelling decisions primarily on what people already familiar with the games want to see, whether that means photorealistic renderings of their favorite characters, or opportunities to rectify minor gripes they may have had with the games. And this priority certainly came across in my experience with the show. Something that alienated me early on was the amount of praise for the show's almost religious fealty to the game's cutscenes, which I learned about through the many side-by-side comparisons flooding the internet. Totally generic shot-reverse-shot sequences I wouldn't have thought twice about were going viral because it was the exact same generic shot-reverse-shot coverage that was in the game. Call it a pretentious take, but I find that there is absolutely no artistic merit to Mazin's fan-first approach. Why go through all the trouble and all the money to bring this story into a new medium when this is all you're gonna do with it? Why not just pull a Kingdom Hearts and release a movie out of the cutscenes? Call it The Last of Us 1.5. We've heard this "we made it for the fans" line of reasoning from directors like Zack Snyder before, who employ it to essentially absolve themselves of their own creative decision-making. People like the source material, and we basically just followed that, so I don't know what the issue is. At that point, you're just reviving a hollow corpse, making a multi-million-dollar fan film. In the case of The Last of Us, I know the games are notorious for their extensive cutscenes, and you could argue that the show, as a result, almost came pre-storyboarded, much like Snyder's comic adaptations. I would instead use a term like pre-packaged, maybe prefabricated. But the problem is that the games are not 100% cutscenes, they are in fact video games. There is other material supplementing those cutscenes in order to create the overall experience of The Last of Us. So taking such a literal approach to adapting them was never gonna work. What do we lose when we lose gameplay, and how do we make up for it? This is, of course, the essential question when it comes to video game adaptations, and this is something Mazin seems, frankly, afraid to confront, sticking to his instincts as a fan of the games. Even the game's creator, Neil Druckmann, seems to have understood that an adaptation to a different medium requires more fundamental reworking, a sentiment that was shot down by Mazin by his own account. That's how you wind up with episodes built around totally empty obstacles that make sense in the context of gameplay, such as in the case of Season 1's, "Oh no, our path is blocked by debris, we'll have to find another way around." Or in Season 2, when there are like a dozen guards with narrow cones of vision, an age-old video game mechanic, but watching real actors act it out seems impossible that Ellie could climb this metal staircase without being spotted. When we are not ourselves navigating these scenarios as the characters, it's hard to get invested in what happens. The fix for this would be figuring out obstacles that challenge or in some way engage a character's personal and emotional stakes rather than just their physical stakes. And that's not something The Last of Us does particularly well. Worse, though, is the number of changes that do occur, which seem to be born purely out of a desire to keep things fresh for the longtime fans. After the series first debuted, I can't tell you how many times I heard friends of mine losing their minds over, "Oh my god, they changed it from spores to tendrils, this is genius." My response was pretty much, okay, that's cool. I don't know anything about the spores. Such changes, which prioritize viewers' relationship with the source material over the show's own immediate narrative concerns, strike me as just as artless and pandery as the shot-for-shot recreations. It's one thing if that relationship is used for subtext or meta-commentary, but not when it's influencing pivotal narrative decisions. And for that reason, maybe the switch from spores to tendrils isn't the best example here. I don't think I exactly lost much by not knowing about the spores. And maybe spores even posed a narrative or world-building issue that tendrils solved. I wouldn't know and I wouldn't care, but the amount of attention focused on this one specific detail signaled to me early on that the show was mining a lot of its goodwill from prior knowledge of the game, and that I was out of the club, so to speak. I would actually say the most detrimental example of what I'm trying to illustrate here can be found in Season 2, in which the settlement our characters move into is attacked by a massive horde of zombies. A development I'm told was totally invented for the show. I don't want to get into the weeds too early here, but the catalyst for the second game and the second season of the show is Joel's death, which kickstarts a revenge quest through sheer propulsive anger and mourning. His death is supposed to be this unthinkable, unprecedented tragedy in the story, after we've been so endeared to him as the protagonist of the first game and the first season. But by putting these two developments in the same episode, the show shoehorns his death in at the very end of this other unthinkable, unprecedented tragedy, so the two kind of cancel each other out, and the impact of Joel's death is significantly dampened. This reminds me of a similar incident in The Walking Dead. A massive spoiler I'll give you 5 seconds to click away from. This is me from the future. I forgot to record a 5-second bit I could do while you're waiting for the spoiler countdown to go. So basically, the character Negan kills the character Glenn in the 100th issue of the comics. This is an unthinkable, unprecedented tragedy, as Glenn is basically a day one character and a fan favorite. In adapting this moment, the show drags the whole Negan sequence out by killing a different character, Abraham, first, just to shake things up a little bit for us. But then they still try to pull off the shock of Glenn's death, not realizing how they've watered that emotional impact down. On a lesser note, Abraham's comic death is then transposed onto another character we care way less about, so that moment also ends up being a dud in the show. I make this comparison partly because The Last of Us seems to pride itself on being a desensationalized take on a zombie story, in direct opposition to The Walking Dead, but it invariably falls into the same sensationalized pitfalls nonetheless. This is a point I'll harp more on later. In my last video, I emphasized the importance of status quo in a TV show, of having a regular sense of stasis constantly reinforced in each episode. I argued that by being in standardized situations with a regular cast week after week, we live with the characters and form a relationship with them. In video games, this relationship is largely bred from the gameplay, from occupying these characters' bodies and essentially being them. This is the general video game philosophy I'm basing my arguments on here, by the way. Even though I haven't played The Last of Us games, I know that they exist, so I can't help but think about them in relation to the show. In an alternate reality, I would have somehow been oblivious to these incredibly popular games over the past 12 years, and would then be able to engage with the show in a vacuum. But unfortunately, that's not the reality we live in. Even in this alternate reality, though, I think moments like the debris and the guards I discussed earlier would still telegraph something suspiciously video gamey about the show to me. On that note, I want to emphasize one more time that I haven't played the games, so feel free to call what I'm about to say horse shit. I can already imagine the comments I'm gonna get. But in the games, I'm willing to bet that it's the sequences that don't really contribute to the story. Say there's a room full of, 20 zombies that you have to kill, and you'll die and restart and spend 3 hours trying to clear this room, 3 hours that don't actively advance the story, that really build that relationship. Yes, there are hours of emotional, heart-wrenching narrative in the cutscenes, but this is how we live with the characters, so to speak. And this is how video games pull off their own sense of status quo. It makes sense to cut this stuff out in a more passive storytelling format, but Mazen's weird half-fidelity to the games continues to prove problematic. His attempt at circumventing mindless action is to instead operate more in the mode of a grounded drama. And people were a bit up in arms about the lack of action in a zombie show, but I'm not necessarily bothered by that switch up in and of itself. You want to sideline action and narrative busywork in favor of grounded character moments? I think that's great. Now, where are the character moments? Where are the character moments? Aside from these two, everyone else in the show is a pretty one-dimensional side character, which I find really odd considering the show is trying to do the whole, what if they made The Walking Dead, but it was empathetic and humanist and focused on people's lives? Yet the characters are so much less dynamic here. I think about Catherine O'Hara in Season 2, who's a therapist that's always drunk and high. A fun opportunity for a dynamic, contradictory character who provides some change of pace to the rest of the show. Except in every scene she's in, she basically just restates her two character traits. I'm a therapist, and I'm drunk and high right now.
Well, I'm an alcoholic, and I smoke as much weed as I can.
I think the clearest example of swapping action gameplay for drama is the case of Long Long Time, the infamous Season 1 episode that focuses on Nick Offerman's Bill. In my last video, I argued the stratification of this episode from the perspective of the season's overall structure, but I'm going to take it a step further here. It's my understanding that in the game, Bill joins your party briefly while you're looking for a car battery. Having a mission together that requires gameplay, I theorize, inherently builds a relationship with Bill. Mazen correctly identified that building an entire episode around looking for a car battery would not be the best use of our time, but he finds something compelling in Bill, and instead crafts this entire episode as a standalone human story about him. But because we never actually see him interact with Joel and Ellie, only one scene with Joel in the flashback, he's stratified to a degree that we don't actually feel any relationship here. He's basically an abstract figure to us. It's almost completely arbitrary that we even get the car battery framing device to justify the episode, because it might as well be an anthology about the various domestic ways people cope with the apocalypse. And that would be cool, it'd be compelling, but it's not really what this show is, and it never does anything like this again. So not only does it really feel like a lump in the show's overall structure, but more importantly, we don't feel any impact these events may have on Joel and Ellie. So if the idea was to swap car battery gameplay for car battery drama, then there was not an equivalent exchange of emotional impact in the process. Maybe that sounds too mathematical, but I think digressions like this, which severely eat away at the show's limited runtime, do significant damage to the emotional payoff we're supposed to have later. As far as developing Joel and Ellie's relationship with each other, what Mazen is left with without gameplay is a trove of painfully forced dialogue. There's no real dramatic friction between these two. They bicker and have some differences, but it's nothing that challenges their getting from A to B. There's nothing about their character that opposes each other to such a degree as to threaten the goal of the story, and they don't have very conflicting philosophies either. This makes for some pretty undramatic storytelling, and without gameplay or very many combat sequences to supplement things, Mazen overcompensates with incredibly thin attempts at witty banter, in which every character speaks in the same snarky vernacular. The entire backbone of their relationship basically hinges on a book of puns, which the show acknowledges as lame in a very semi-ironic way, where even though it's lame, it's actually hinging a lot of emotional weight on this device. There's almost a secondhand embarrassment that comes with each joke. Like, the more glee the characters get out of it, the more painful it is for us to watch. And I get that, our sense of humor doesn't have to align with that of a character who isn't us, but I don't know, the disproportionate reaction to what the joke actually is makes it all the more grating. Watching the characters entertain each other feels like the show is trying really hard to gaslight us into thinking the dialogue actually is entertaining. You could also argue the case that, this is intentional dad humor, and Joel developing an increasingly paternal relationship to Ellie is serviced by lame dad jokes, but then other characters later in the show talk in the same dad joke way, which kind of exposes the whole thing as an inability to write dynamically in other characters' voices. These uncomfortable, forced interactions are not the only symptom of the show's inability to compensate for lack of gameplay, though. The general shape of the first season suffers too, resulting in a series of false starts and a sense of perpetual first act we're stuck in for like half the season. The first 2 episodes both end on a note of, okay, now they're finally on their journey. Can't wait to see what happens in the next one. Then we get the Bill flashback episode, which disrupts any momentum that had been built up to that point. Not long after, we get a 3-month time skip and another flashback, and then we're suddenly in the endgame. The only real second act we get is this little Melanie Linsky detour that is severely underdeveloped and basically a total nothing burger. As the season went on, I could buy that they were maybe going for some slow burn pacing. I would turn to my friends who played the games who would assure me, oh, when it picks up, it picks up. And then before I even had the ability to process it, the season was over. It never picked up. These digressions and flashbacks and time skips felt to me like pushing vegetables around on a plate to give the illusion of eating them. I felt almost swindled, like the show was trying to convince me I had just watched a story, when what I actually watched was 9 hours of dancing around a story. Season 2 does the exact same thing when it speedruns the journey from Jackson to Seattle. We get a couple breaks for some forced dialogue between Dina and Ellie, but most of this trip is conveyed in montage. Call me crazy, but this is the story. I know it's the journey, not the destination, is a cliche, but it's true. The fact that they only really start pushing the emotional beats when Ellie and Dina get to Seattle after at least a week of traveling makes it feel incredibly rushed and unearned when the two start breaking out I love you. This season is 2 episodes shorter than the first season, and it feels like any sort of second act was just totally scooped out here. Once again, the show fails to perform sufficient character legwork, fails to provide a sense of a relationship organically building and developing, so it has to go out of its way to hammer us over the head with its emotional intent, to force us into believing these two are in love. You'll notice I keep talking about the show in very duplicitous terms, like it keeps trying to trick us into thinking either a joke is funny, or a substantive journey has unfolded, or that 2 characters are in love, and that's because the story is essentially an extended thought exercise. In order for either finale to make any sort of logical sense, the show has to hit a specific set of beats for there to be any emotional payoff. But when it skips over the meat and potatoes of its character arcs, it struggles to organically hit those beats, so it just tells us explicitly what's up and hopes we get the same payoff out of it. This probably sounds a little vague, so let me illustrate with Season 1, whose big reveal is that the resistance group, the Fireflies, plans to kill Ellie to make a vaccine out of her antibodies. That was the purpose of this whole escort mission. The thought exercise conceit is that it takes the trolley problem and de-abstracts it, so that we actually experience the emotional pressure put on us when it comes time to make the decision. As Joel. As a side note, I do think it's a little funny how, on paper, this situation differs from the trolley problem in that there's no guarantee killing Ellie would actually result in a vaccine. Just thinking about it in practical terms, all the trials that go into making a vaccine, having only one specimen to pull from, the lack of testing if there was a way to keep her alive, or to even, periodically pull her blood while she continues to produce more blood or something like that. So in theory, there's the added decision-making component of this might not even work, in which case pulling the trolley lever would actually kill everyone, when there might be a scenario where nobody dies, clouding one's judgment. But in order to keep things within the parameters of the original trolley problem, the characters have to verbally confirm on numerous occasions that this would have worked, and there's no other way it could have happened. I actually don't even mind that much. I'm not gonna go so far as to call this a plot hole. I just think it's funny the level of trust me, I swear going on here. But anyway, for Joel, he lost his daughter at the start of the outbreak, and over the course of the journey, he's begun to latch onto Ellie like his own daughter. So a parental instinct kicks in, and that's what causes him to mow down the Fireflies. Supposedly in the game, he starts out as this really hardened guy who basically has no humanity at first, a human weapon, and that's why he's chosen to to escort Ellie, and the emotional journey of the game is watching that armor unpeel as he opens up to her and becomes a person. This final act against the Fireflies punctuating his transformation into someone who acts on human emotion rather than cruel pragmatism. This change of heart is the prerequisite beat the show has to make sure we feel, otherwise the climax just feels like random carnage. But that transformation doesn't really come across in how we see these characters interact. I love Pedro Pascal as much as the next person, but I do not buy for a second that he is anything other than a softie throughout the entire series, that any curmudgeonly behavior is anything but superficial. I don't know, he just doesn't have the grit. He seems to care about Ellie more than he lets on from the start, and there's a warmth to him in general that makes it impossible to believe he's this cruel, hardened animal. As a result, the show has to tell us he is one through exposition, which mostly boils down to, did you know Joel has killed people? In the zombie apocalypse? This guy's a monster. Then, of course, the only real mediation we're given to see his transformation is that Book of Puns banter. So, we go from a not very convincing starting point, and we meander to an endpoint that basically just confirms that Joel is the person we thought he was at the start. Yet again, even though I haven't played the games, I can't help but think of it in terms of what the lack of gameplay does here. How not controlling the final sequence yourself makes it impossible to invest in what's happening. One of the contentious aspects of the games is this notion of forcing you to do something in order to advance the narrative and continue the game, and then shaming you, or at least making you reflect on making that decision. In this case, in order to beat the game, you have to mow down the Fireflies to protect Ellie. You can't choose to let them go through with the operation. Many critics of this approach point to the fact that you actually didn't make this decision, so how dare the game shame you for it? I think this critique is understandable, but somewhat misguided, stemming from the false assumption that a game is supposed to give you, the player, complete agency. I think the intended effect is just to put you in the headspace of someone who makes a decision you may not make yourself in order to better understand how they came to that decision, rather than to say, you did something fucked up, what does this say about your base instincts? And this opens up a whole other can of worms regarding the rhetorical value of staying this locked into the human experience, as opposed to zooming out and using the medium to convey bigger picture ideas. Wherever you land on any of these issues, however, is irrelevant here, because the way this all goes down in the show is completely passive and hollow as we watch Joel perform the climax in this unengaging shaky cam montage. This is exactly what I was talking about earlier regarding physical stakes versus emotional stakes. Even though this whole sequence is basically one extended moral decision, the way it plays out is completely one note. The show puts all of its eggs in one basket with this big reveal. The story is very much this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, with nothing really building on each other. So when the second to last episode ended, I felt no sense of approaching a finale, no sense of all the narrative threads coming together into a critical moment as they approach the Fireflies. The reveal is the entire story, intended to retroactively justify everything that came before it. But since the emotional groundwork had not been properly laid, it just kinda lands with a thud. This is why trying such a one-to-one approach in translating the game is a bad idea. There are crucial innards missing in the adaptation process, and to compensate for them, Mazin tries these band-aid fixes when a much more fundamental reworking of the material was required. And Season 2 is no better, but before I get into that execution, I want to talk for a moment about the other root problem with the show I outlined earlier. Just as fatal as the show's fidelity to the source material is the pressure put upon it to basically be the next Game of Thrones, which is but one instance of the show relying on a broader appeal to the establishment at every turn. This is a show utterly seduced by narrative and visual conceits pulled from other shows without understanding the core motivations behind their original usage and attempting to reconstruct them to signal its own prestige, in doing so shooting itself in the foot. It's no accident, a Last of Us adaptation was in the works for years after the game was released, and Arya Stark actress Maisie Williams was even the predominant fan cast to play Ellie for a while, until too much time had passed for this to be feasible. Once Game of Thrones ended, however, there was a scramble to fill that void in the TV space. As it so happened, airing alongside the last season of Game of Thrones was one Chernobyl, which adjacent placement is largely responsible for the miniseries getting so many eyes on it early on. So how Mazin got HBO to bite is not exactly the biggest mystery in the world here. The influence of that show is pervasive in this one. Instead of Williams, Mazin cast a later Game of Thrones favorite Bella Ramsey in the role alongside middle-era Game of Thrones favorite Pedro Pascal. They even got Game of Thrones director Mark Mylod to direct the very Thrones-esque invasion of Jackson in Season 2. The most shameless instance of copying Game of Thrones homework, however, is the show's opening credit sequence, which is a total knockoff. This one is especially bad because it is so inconsistent with the tone of of the rest of the series, there's no other way to justify it other than as an attempt to stimulate the same pleasure centers in our brains that Game of Thrones used to trigger. It doesn't just stop at Game of Thrones, though. Other HBO shows like The Leftovers seem to inform the Lindelofian, humanist, flashback-heavy aspect of the show, and it expectedly owes some debt to The Walking Dead for creating a long-form framework for a zombie show in the first place. In Season 2, The Last of Us does some stunt casting with Josh Peck in a bit role, seeming to capitalize on the hype his stunt casting in Oppenheimer generated. And I would be remiss not to point out that stunt casting for a soldier who only appears in one scene is yet another Game of Thrones tactic. There's really little the show is able to create for itself without pulling from any of these other sources, but it's also far too earnest to present itself as some sort of postmodern amalgamation of influences. To me, this is simply the most white elephant show on TV, completely pandering to things the institutions already like and approve of. There's zero risk-taking, all just telegraphing taste. Basically another form of fan service. Speaking of, maybe this is a more minor gripe, but in the same way that every zombie show ends up being some sort of libertarian fantasy, I find The Last of Us is also a fantasy in which Gen Xers get to impose dad music and dad culture onto the youth. This is what the world used to be, kids. Ellie is Maison's fantasy of a Gen Zer who fucks with dad music.
Fleetwood Mac. Nope. What?
I mean, no, it's my opinion.
Yeah, well, your opinion is wrong because Frank Zappa exists.
There is a milieu of Gen X male screenwriters that this all feels particularly pandery to. Craig Mazin himself, C. Robert Cargill and Scott Derrickson, Christopher McQuarrie, James Gunn, Ryan Johnson, James Mangold, a cabal of people whose work I enjoy to wildly varying degrees. But they all fall under this umbrella. They all have a way of signaling their taste to others with the same taste, as though this mutual taste is supposed to supplant the actual dramatic material of whatever we're actually watching. And this leads me to one of my biggest complaints, one that probably won't sound good coming out of my mouth, but one I stand by firmly. This show is too damn cozy. I know we're like 20 years into the apocalypse by this point, and society starting to rebuild itself is an interesting departure from most zombie media taking place in the immediate aftermath of an outbreak. But for as dark and bleak as the show tries to be, it never shakes this very sanitized, comfortable sensation. At every turn, the show strives to be as palatable as possible. In general, the hair and makeup and costuming seem almost afraid of alienating viewers by making the characters even mildly dirty after weeks of camping and traveling and fighting in rain and snow and mud. Even looking at some of the side-by-side comparisons to the game, where the wardrobe and the production design and even sometimes the lighting are exactly the same, there's a texture to the cutscenes that is totally sterilized in the show. The biggest culprit here is the docu-realistic cinematography, which I find to be possibly the most disingenuous aspect of the entire show. Once again, it's true that a lot of the coverage is recreating the cutscenes shot for shot, but in general, the show seems to take an almost radical approach against expressing anything with lighting and composition. Shaky cam, unflattering mid-afternoon shadows.
But man, you can't deny that view.
The show by design looks like someone just picked up a camera and started filming, and I believe this boils down to what I would call an acoustic sensibility. I'm sure this word probably comes to mind because of the literal prominence of the acoustic guitar in the show, but I also use it because the show invokes this vibe of just sitting down on the porch, belting its soul out without pretense, without showmanship, just earnestness and honesty. It seems to stem from the mindset of, intentional lighting and composition is actually manipulative, and we want to be honest with our audience by not trying to sway them any which way. And I think that, in and of itself, is a total lie and is actually the most manipulative shit I've ever seen. The proper response to the argument that filmmaking is manipulative is to go, yes, and here's what we can do with it once we all acknowledge that. Not to go, but actually not in our case. This is part and parcel with how shallow the characters are. The show seems to operate with an understanding that shooting actors like their documentary subjects inherently gives them the dimensionality of a real person. But expressing nothing with the camera, while the actors are given nothing to chew on, does not turn into some magical double negative where it actually feels like we're watching real life reflected back at us. It just emphasizes how empty everything is. And this feeling is only heightened when the show occasionally does dip its toes into theatrics. It exposes the whole thing to be a sham. This brings me back to the Walking Dead comparison. After complaints about the first season's lack of action, Mason seems to have misdiagnosed the root problem people were responding to. It wasn't the lack of action itself, it was that the humanist drama he replaced it with was just sterile. So he seems to have overcompensated this season, with that full-scale assault on Jackson happening in the second episode, followed by much more frequent action set pieces. But action has never been this show's bread and butter, so most of these sequences feel really one note, containing more contrivances per capita than even The Walking Dead is guilty of. Look at the Joel Deus Ex Machina saving Abby, the big zombie dying right in front of Tommy, the Jesse Deus Ex Machina in Seattle. I mean, these are real bottom-of-the-barrel devices for building tension that the show seems to think it's above, yet is maybe the worst perpetrator of these cliches I've ever seen. The same goes for how much dialogue is devoted to tactical jargon in the show. Mason is not someone with tactical combat experience. I am also not someone with tactical combat experience, and watching Ellie or Joel or Dina or Tommy or Jesse talk tactical jargon sounds like how it would sound if I tried to write this. I can't explain it any other way.
We hit them here, 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 here.
Stay down, you stay low, you stay quiet.
Should we stick to the road, scan the countryside, hit our checkpoints, and sign the logbooks?
Again, the show postures itself as something much more nourishing, something much more soulful, something much more honest than these other sensationalized zombie shows and movies, but it's victim to the same exact theatrics that those other shows and movies lean into. It just feels hypocritical. As of season 2, there are now 3 flashback episodes, and all of them, I shit you not, are literally just the opening sequence of Up. I'm not kidding. Long, Long Time, Left Behind, and The Price all follow the exact same structure. Happy memories, a little bit of tension burbles, and then someone dies. Happy memories, a little bit of tension, then someone dies. Happy, tension, someone dies. Or rather, is implied to die. All of these episodes keep a tasteful distance from actually showing the deaths on screen. At least Up has the decency of doing this whole shotgunning through a relationship thing through an intentionally over-romanticized lens, rose-colored glasses and what have you. The Last of Us's insistence on this acoustic naturalism strikes me as so much more phony and dishonest, specifically because it has this honesty chip on its shoulder. And it's not just visual comfort or palatability the show is scared of disrupting, but emotional comfort and palatability. At every opportunity, there's too much catharsis. I once again have to point to the Bill episode as an illuminating example here. A piece I linked to in my last video discusses how giving Bill and Frank a picture-perfect Lifetime original romance may feel like a breath of fresh air in the genre, but actually waters down the elements of their relationship that made the original characters feel nuanced and human, minor as they were. This is a trap the show falls into again and again. Season 2 especially is caked in therapy speak, with Gail introducing herself in a sequence where she gains closure with Joel for a conflict we won't know anything about for several more episodes. When it happens in the flashback, we already know that they've buried the hatchet about as much as they could. Another scene that struck me this way, which I know is basically beat for beat in the game, is when Joel confesses to Ellie about killing the Fireflies. The season hints at a huge schism between Joel and Ellie, and there's additional tragedy to the fact that he died before they could reconcile their issue. But right before the season ends, the show has to assure us, don't worry, they got all their cards on the table the night before Joel died. I understand that this doesn't completely resolve their issues, they aren't exactly buddy-buddy when Joel dies, but leaving no stone left unturned this way strikes me as pretty detached from reality. The central love triangle with Dina and Jesse is resolved when Jesse tells Ellie, well, I love Dina, but not as profoundly as you, the main character, love her. I conveniently had a secret love of my life years ago, so you're basically off the hook. Even Maria gets an opportunity to rectify a minor argument with Joel from the first episode. We don't need this. People can have conflict with each other. It's okay. I think the games are much more forthcoming about the manipulation inherent to their premises. As far as I'm told, the whole idea of the second game is to hit you at the midpoint like, oh, you felt very strongly a certain way, didn't you? Well, now you're gonna do it all again, and we're gonna make you feel the exact opposite way. This little switcheroo does not have that same punch at the end of Season 2, and I think that artificially honest visual language is at least largely responsible for that. Season 2, like Season 1, functions as an extended thought exercise, this time demonstrating the futility of revenge and the seduction of it from an immediate, on-the-ground perspective. Just like the first installment, which takes a philosophical conundrum that, when zoomed out and abstracted, seems like an easy decision to make, kill the one to save the many, and shows you how when you experience it subjectively, it becomes a lot harder to actually make that decision, and in fact feels justified to do the opposite. So too does this season take a supposedly easy decision to make. Don't seek violent retribution because it won't actually make things right or make you feel better, and shows how Ellie feels justified in making the opposite decision. But I see season 2 as an even bigger failure than season 1, because it fails to properly tap into the subjective rage that guides Ellie along on her revenge quest. We see her shoddy justification for it, where she plays the semantic game of calling it justice instead of retribution. We see her make rash decisions throughout the course of the whole season, and we feel outside of her. We see these as impulsive and foolish and selfish, rather than understanding and feeling the urgency she feels and buying into the mission. She feels like a kid when we're supposed to feel like a kid along with her. When people tell her that this is a bad idea, they're right, and we have no reason to feel opposed to them. The sense of injustice that the community votes against her is supposed to be the flame that lights the fuse of Ellie taking charge herself, but I guess the show does too good a job of presenting the town's argument against seeking revenge. Then when things go wrong for Ellie, yeah, it makes sense. The one good thing I'll say about the finale is that it's the first time the show actually truly taps into the utter feel-bad bleakness people have told me the games are like. It feels like the summation of Ellie's poor decision-making. Punishment in and of itself for seeking selfish, individual retribution. Finally an earned emotional moment. And then we get this perspective shift to Abby. As this concept has been explained to me in the game, I think it's a really brilliant narrative conceit. But as I see it play out in the show, I don't see what new insight we're supposed to gain from following Abby's perspective of the events in Seattle, when season 2 from Ellie's perspective already dishes out all the cosmic punishment we need to understand how ill-conceived the mission was. The story actually hammers it on way thicker than it needs to, with Ellie letting Mel's baby die as a foil to Dina's baby. They're just like us for real. One potential reason I can point to for the failure of this conclusion is that despite being narratively punished left and right, and admonished by other characters, there's still a lot of moral flip-flopping and people still trying to absolve Ellie. After raging out a little too hard and torturing Nora, Dina tells her, "I'm sure you had your reasons," and Ellie expresses moral doubt. Then 20 minutes later, she remorselessly keeps going after Abby's friends. And then after all this, Jesse says,
"If I were out there somewhere, lost and in trouble, you would set the world on fire to save me."
When like 15 minutes earlier in the episode, Jesse's like, "Ellie, Tommy is alone and in danger, and we need to save him." And she basically tells him to fuck off, Tommy's fine. I don't actually believe she'd save Jesse if the situation had ever presented itself. For what it's worth, I don't think the moment 2 seconds later where Jesse gets shot in the face really applies to what he's talking about here. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, again, the show is afraid of icky conflict and tries to absolve Ellie as much as possible. But then it also deals for the consequences of her actions so ham-fistedly that we don't need to see Abby's side of the story to understand it. Another potential reason for this failure is that the show betrays its conceit of subjectivity. I don't know how it is in the game, but the fact that we actually get some cutaways of the wolves and earlier on of Abby and her gang seems to betray the notion that we are locked into Ellie's perspective here. It feels a lot more arbitrary that the show is withholding information from us for the sake of giving us a rug pull later on. I have no idea why they even bother cutting away to like Jeffrey Wright torturing a Scar, or this pack of Scars who we eventually see slaughtered. Ellie interacts with both groups involved in this civil war. We have enough of a hint that some broader conflict is brewing in Seattle, enough to disorient us, and also to plant the seeds for Abby's side of the story next season. The show even pulls one of the most outrageous narrative digressions I've ever seen to emphasize the conflict brewing. You know what? I'm not even going to talk about the million things wrong with this boat sequence. If I get started, I won't be able to stop, and I'm pissing and moaning enough as it is. Because the show cuts away from Ellie to show these groups on their own anyway, it just makes us think, why don't we see what Abby's up to right now if the show has no problem drifting away from Ellie's perspective? So where do we go from here? I actually have no idea what happens in the game after the little switcheroo, so I'm basically completely in the dark. The optimist in me wants to say that maybe Craig Mazin will learn his lesson and do something a little bolder with the next season, but the optimist in me has been pretty much unconscious for the duration of this video. And I hate to say it, I don't see season 3 switching up the formula all that much. For what it's worth, I think Caitlin Dever has the juice to carry a season, and I enjoyed her little crew, so I'm hoping it'll be nice to see them in action. Really, if the show knows what's good for it, it'll be 7 hours of Jeffrey Wright somberly monologuing, and we'd all just tune in to listen to the timbre of his voice. And then I can log on to youtube.com and say that now the show is reheating Wes Anderson's nachos. Okay, real conclusion. I have no emotional stake in The Last of Us. In Craig Mazin's own words,
"That complexity is why The Last of Us as a narrative is so gorgeous. It's why it's the most beautiful story told in the entire genre of video games. It's why Neil is a genius, and it's why I wanted to make the show in the first place.
Well, to that I say, what a testament to video games as a medium, that the greatest story ever told translates to such inert bullshit in film. Okay, so I'm jumping back in real quick to say that I'm almost done editing this video, and in the process, I've watched a lot more footage of the games than I'd seen before. I gotta say, they look pretty good. I understand the attachment people have to these scenarios and these characters. I know a lot of the things I complained about in this video are not unique to the show, but I see how they worked in their original iteration, and watching it now feels like reverse engineering where the emotional core got lost in the process of preserving that outer shell of iconography. I haven't had this sort of moment of, oh my god, maybe this actually works in some iteration, since watching recordings of the original Broadway production of Dear Evan Hansen after seeing the totally ghoulish film adaptation. That's the sort of company we should hold HBO's The Last of Us in conversation with, rather than any of the prestige TV shows it tries so desperately to wear the clothes of. I had a moment while editing, going through footage of both the show and the games and finding clips, where I genuinely got really sad that this is how I experienced the story. I don't want to get too boo-hoo about it because, like, I can always just play the games and I'm sure I'll still enjoy them. But I think this moment really illuminated for me why I've been so hung up on the show since the moment it debuted. I know they're hoping for a 4-season arc, but I'm really looking forward to Mason moving on to greener pastures. Hopefully something not attached to any sort of IP. I don't know. Until then, I strongly urge you to like, share, comment, subscribe, check out my Patreon where you can find exclusive movie reviews as well as plenty of other podcast-style videos. The choice is yours. That's it from me this time around. Thank you for watching, and... Is he gonna do it? Is he gonna do it?